Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weep Union, and in this one there are numerous advances in favor of the Russians across the front line, mainly centered around the Toretsk region, with a single advance within the Sumy region within the town of Unikivka, where the Russians now almost have full control over the town. In the southern parts of the front line, the Russians continued advances along the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region into the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia regions. The Russians managed to advance in the northern and western flanks of Pokrovsk, with additional advances in the direction of Konstantinivka. On the eastern bank of the Serebryansky river line, the Russians managed to advance both in the direction of Siversk, but also within the Serebriansky forest area, where the Russians almost have full control over the entire eastern bank of the Serebryansky river line. In the entire river line, the Russians made significant advances within the Serebriansky forest area, gaining control of approximately 14 square kilometers over the past 24 hours, with additional advances on the northern flank of Lyman as the pressure on the town continues. Starting out in that direction where the most significant developments have taken place, the Russians continue offensive operations along the Serebriansky forest area, gaining control over a vast area. Connecting their forces in the southern outskirts, where they managed to advance south along the road, gain control of the fortified positions and the outpost down towards the river line here, the Siversk river line, and the southern parts of the Serebriansky forest area. They then connected through the road, connecting to the south of Lyman with their forces here in the south, connecting their forces, encircling the Ukrainian forces, and pushing through along the main road. And with that, the Russians made a large-scale assault on these fortified positions and the remaining positions of the Ukrainians within the area, while the Ukrainians have been withdrawing for the past few days, meaning that the majority have managed to get out under fire of Russian forces through artillery and FPV drones. But with this, there is still a sliver of Ukrainian forces here in the southern parts of the Serebriansky forest area, which now risk complete encirclement. They are widely operationally encircled with a wide section of the front line, where they are completely exposed to Russian fire and would have to withdraw a significant distance to get out from the front line. The Russians will likely gain control over the remaining parts within the next few days. During the withdrawal of the Ukrainian forces from the area, this will allow the Russians to start pressure on the settlements of the Ukrainians here along the northern bank of the Siversk river line, the direction of Yampil and Dronivka on the southern bank, on the flank of Siversk. At the same time, allow the Russians to infiltrate the western bank of the Serebryansky river line along the Serebriansky forest area towards the southern flank of Sarishne and in the direction of Lyman itself. In the northern flank of Lyman, the Russians have managed to gain control of the remaining parts of Kulidyasi and are pressuring Myrnohrad from the north in the direction of Sarishne, with pressure on the fish farm area as well to gain full control over the Serebryansky river line. This will allow the Russians to put pressure on Sarishne and Stavki on the northern flank of Lyman, with the pressure on the supply lines to the northwest of Lyman. It is only a matter of time before the Russians start storming the city itself from the northern, eastern, southeastern, and northwestern directions, attacking it from 4 separate directions through some of these roads leading into the town. The Ukrainians still have some fortified positions at the outskirts of the town. However, the Ukrainians have suffered a lot of setbacks over the past few weeks, which has led to the loss of the Serebriansky forest area, and the Russian pressure is increasing, not decreasing, as the days go by. In the Siversk direction, the Russians continue to advance south of Serebryanka as they look to gain control over everything east of the defensive line north of Siversk, gaining control over which will allow the Russians to put pressure on Dronivka on the northern flank of Siversk, bypassing the town of Siversk entirely and connecting with the forces within the Serebriansky forest area. This could lead to a flanking maneuver on the rear of Siversk, cutting off some of the supply lines that connects Lyman with Siversk and flanking Siversk from the northern direction. Further south in the direction of Konstantinivka, the Russians continue their offensive operations to close the pocket west of Toretsk. The Russians have managed to gain control over the fortified positions east of Katerinivka and the majority of the town itself, pushing the Ukrainians to the outskirts of it in the northeastern outskirts, and pushing them in the direction of Libanbik, which is the last settlement here west of Toretsk, which remains under Ukrainian control, south of the reservoir. Russians will then push to gain full control over the pocket and then onwards towards Pleshivka and Ivanopilya for further offensive operations from the southern and eastern directions of the city. To the west, in the Pokrovsk direction, on the northern flank of the city, the Russians continue storming Rodinsk from the northern and eastern directions, but remain to gain control over a wider area on the northern flank as they continue offensive operations to the east of the anti-tank ditches and Dragon Teeth defensive line, which they are taking advantage of here to the west of Toretsk and down towards Rodinsk. If they're able to gain control over the main residential area and the apartment complex area within the city, they'll have full control over it and cut off the main highway to the north of Pokrovsk. Combined with this, the Russians are storming the northern flank of Myrnohrad, taking control over some fortified positions along the waste heap, which overlooks the city, which the Russians have had control of for many weeks now. The Russians are storming Myrnohrad from the north, combined with the industrial area to the east, to gain control over some of the highways leading into the city and to gain control over the northern and eastern flanks to push into it and start the battle over Myrnohrad on the eastern flank of Pokrovsk to spread out the Ukrainian forces defending the northern flank of the city from the ones in the southern flank of the city, meaning that the Ukrainians now are having defensive positions all along the entire front line within Pokrovsk. With the reinforcements that the Ukrainians have sent to this section of the front line, they're able to defend all of these areas, but this keeps these Ukrainian forces in the defense of Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad rather than allowing them to relocate to other sectors of the front line, such as Konstantinivka or Lyman. Following the Ukrainian counterattack within Udashne, the Russians launched their own push to gain control over the northern central parts of the town. This pushes the Ukrainians to the western outskirts along the 20406 highway. Russians are here looking to gain full control over Dashne to start offensive operations in the northern and western directions from it. The Russians are now nearing the endgame with control over the majority of the town. They can start pushing the Ukrainians to the outskirts. This will lead to decreased Ukrainian defensive capabilities in the area and the open road for the coal mine here to the north of Udashne, gaining control over which will solidify their western flank for the siege of Pokrovsk and start the siege of the E50 highway to the northwest of the city, cutting off the final roads leading into the city simultaneously with the offensive operations taking place within Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad. If the Russians are able to cut off the supplies leading into Pokrovsk following the Ukrainian reinforcements arriving to the city, then they will gain even more benefits from the capture of it compared to prior to the Ukrainian reinforcements arriving. If the Russians are able to not just bypass the Ukrainian counterattack capabilities and reinforcements by continuing the offensive operations and increasing the pressure on the Ukrainian forces, keeping them there and still achieving success, while launching additional offensive operations in other sectors of the front line where the Ukrainian forces can no longer be redirected to due to their situation in the western parts of the Donetsk region, the Ukrainian forces are getting grounded down on a wide front as Russians continue offensive operations, and even the Ukrainians launching counterattacks cannot stabilize the frontline positions as the Russians continue their pressure all across the front line. The fact that the Ukrainians with their counterattack did manage to regain some positions but failed to stop Russian advances shows that the Russian forces simply have that much of an upper hand these days. Although they cannot win every single battle, they're winning the vast majority of them, and they're able to slowly gain control over additional sections of the front line, increasing the pressure on Ukrainian positions, and the Ukrainians are really in such a difficult position that they cannot return to a stalemate. And this is while the Russians still have a significant amount of forces in reserve, as the main push of their summer offensive has yet to take place. Again, the Russian forces have approximately 600 to 800,000 soldiers fighting within Ukraine, with an additional 200 to 400,000 soldiers in reserve being used for rotations, but also being held in reserve for future offensive operations in other sectors of the front line. As was mentioned by the Ukrainian General Staff, 150,000 soldiers are located along the border area in the northern section of the front line alone, while the ones actually fighting are numbering less than 20,000 soldiers. This is partially what is limiting Ukrainian counterattack capabilities. They have to keep forces in reserve to respond to any potential pushes by the Russians. Simply the Russians not launching any offensive operations by itself with these reserve forces still has a significant impact on the defensive capabilities of the Ukrainians across the front line, forcing the Ukrainians to have some forces in reserve despite the deteriorating situation along the front line. The Ukrainians were able to redirect forces for the defense of the Serebriansky forest area. It would not have collapsed this quickly. However, it would have allowed the Russians to launch an offensive operation in other sectors of the front line, which could have had much worse consequences. In the Sumy region, the Russians continued offensive operations within Yunakivka, almost gaining full control over the town, splitting the town into two parts, the southwestern and southeastern outskirts, which remain under Ukrainian control, as Russians continue their pressure on these positions as they look to kick the Ukrainians out of the town and gain full control of the area and establish a buffer zone around it to establish Yunakivka as a logistical hub for offensive operations within this region towards the second line of defense of the Ukrainians in the Sumy region and to secure their defensive positions and offensive capabilities in the area. In conclusion, the Russian offensive operations are not seeing any significant gains where they are capturing tens, if not hundreds of kilometers a day as a large-scale offensive would. Instead, they're continuing the battle of attrition, just increasing the pressure on the Ukrainians as the Ukrainian defensive capabilities decrease. As they continue to ramp up this pressure, they are achieving more and more success in specific sectors of the front line, where the Ukrainian forces simply do not have the necessary supplies and reinforcements and manpower to hold back the Russians. And once the Russians detect a breaking point where they can start a large-scale offensive and gain massive controls without losing a lot of forces, at that point the Russians would likely be launching their large-scale offensive, which I still expect to take place despite us reaching the end of summer. This just means it'll either be in winter or in the fall season, depending on when the Russians achieve the objectives of the first and second phases of this offensive, which is to gain control over larger logistical hubs, enabling for larger deployments of forces, as well as gaining control over main supply routes that lead into some of these larger cities, such as Zaporizhzhia, Dnipro, Poltava, Kharkiv, in different sectors of the front line. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.